Jamie asked me to talk to you a little bit about the world of government affairs, public policy, the legislative process, how to influence it. But before I do that, I thought I would spend just a couple minutes telling you a little bit about who I am and why I'm here and how I got here. A lot of people ask me, how did you get involved in the world of politics, public policy, public service, and government, and why? And the reason has everything to do with my parents. While growing up in Davis, California, that's where I'm from. Anyone here from California? All right, a few of us. And so that's the reason. And my parents, Luke and Grace Kim, are very different as far as first-generation immigrants from Korea are concerned. They're very different from the standpoint of occupation and, I guess you might say, overall orientation and life values. My parents came here in the late 1950s, which is well before the big wave of immigration from Korea, which was really more in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So they were here well before there was a community of any sort, whether it was a Korean American or Asian American Pacific Islander community. And they were very different from the standpoint of occupation. My father was a psychiatrist. He worked for the California State Prison System. For those of you who are familiar with Northern California, he worked in a prison called California Medical Facility in Vacaville, which is a maximum security prison where he provided psychiatric treatment for some of the most hardcore criminals of our time, including Charles Manson, who recently died, and a name most of you probably do not know, Sirhan Sirhan, who was alleged to have assassinated Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. So my dad treated folks like Sirhan Sirhan and Charles Manson, and a guy named Timothy Leary, known as the father of LSD, a professor at Harvard, who was busted and sent to prison, maximum security prison. So he was pretty different, and on the side he dabbled in mental health issues impacting recent immigrants from Asia. He was very involved and very interested in cultural psychiatry. The idea that the experiences of recent immigrants from Asia have very different and very unique challenges in the mental health area relative to the rest of the population. My mom was also very different as far as occupations go. She was a high school teacher, but she did not teach science or math or art or English. She taught sex education. Can you imagine a first-generation immigrant from Korea teaching sex education? Well, the funny thing is, she taught at the high school where I went. And in my time, sex education was a required class for sophomores. Thankfully, there were 2 teachers teaching that class, and I chose the other teacher. It would have been really embarrassing to have your mom teaching sex education, so that was one way to avoid it. But in any event, so growing up, they were really involved in their local community in Davis. They were really involved in local elections for school board, for city council. They were heavily involved in local nonprofit groups, and they were really big believers in the idea that you have to get involved. You have to be in the game. You can't sit on the sidelines or stand on the sidelines watching the game. You've got to be in the action. You have to have a voice. Just as Esther said, you need a voice both individually and collectively for a community. And they really lived that, and they instilled those values in me and my brother growing up. And one of the most memorable experiences, and this speaks to the law, as Esther talked about, there was a case a long time ago involving a young Asian American named Chol Soo Lee, and this was not a very well-known legal case, because it happened so long ago, and it is not taught in Asian American studies classes today in college. But to make a long story short, Chol Soo Lee was a young immigrant who was wrongly accused of murder in San Francisco's Chinatown. He was a victim of mistaken identity, and he was identified in a police lineup, wrongly identified for a murder he did not commit, and he was sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, he got involved in a fight in prison and killed the other person, so he was really in trouble. Life for sure. This all came to light through investigative journalism, and I know there are journalists here, and they broke the story that he was wrongly accused of murder and was imprisoned, incorrectly imprisoned. And so my parents were involved in an effort to start a legal defense fund for Chol Soo Lee. And it was primarily not Korean Americans, but other Asian American groups, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and others in the San Francisco Bay Area and Northern California who rallied to his defense, raised a ton of money, hired the best legal counsel available, defense attorneys, And eventually, Chol Soo-lee was exonerated and released from prison after a long struggle through the court system. Sadly, after his release from prison, he struggled in life and he lost his life just a few years ago. But the fact is, this was one of the early cases of Asian American activism going back to the early 70s. And watching my parents attend meetings, and many of those meetings took place in the living room in my house. I had no idea what they were talking about and why they're going on so long at night. But that was inspiring. And I think it was through osmosis that I and my brother learned about the value of public service, being involved in one's community, and that's how I got involved. So fast forward to now. Been involved primarily in public service for most of my life in local, state, and federal government, except for the past year and a half when I've been with Hyundai Motor Company here in DC, where I oversee the Washington office, and I lead the effort to lobby Capitol Hill, as well as state legislatures all over the country. And so I want to talk to you very briefly about the role of government affairs, lobbyists, and whether you know it or not, whether you are a professional lobbyist or not, all of us here are lobbyists. If you ever have spoken to your city council member, to your mayor, to a state legislator, a congressman, governor, president, if you ever bent elected officials' ears about anything, you have lobbying. Lobbying is an activity that's protected by the Constitution. Everybody has a right to petition their government, and so you all have done it, or if you haven't done it, you will soon. So I like to talk about the 4 P's of government advocacy, and they are policy, process, politics, and people. And so I'll briefly cover those areas as quickly as I can. Policy, whether your area is healthcare policy, energy, defense, trade, transportation, education, you name it, you've got to be an expert in that area. You have to know what you're talking about. You need to have subject matter level expertise to be able to carry on a conversation and to be able to persuade your audience that your position is the right position. So knowing the policy, knowing it inside and out, backwards and forwards, it's important to develop a level of expertise. You've got to know what you're talking about. So that's policy. Process. For those of you who work on Capitol Hill, or if you aspire to work on Capitol Hill, that's a great place to learn the process in terms of how bills become law, what's the process, how committees work, how the budget process works, the difference between the Senate and the House, and also working the executive branch as well, agencies, and the executive office of the president and the White House. So you have to know the process, how to push buttons, when to do it, when to talk to people. You have to get a feel for timing. And that's all about process, and that's a function of learning from the inside what the process is really all about, not what it says in the textbook in government classes or political science. So you got to know the process from a realistic, pragmatic standpoint. Politics. Every issue is surrounded by politics. You're going to know which members support a particular issue, which members oppose it, and why. Which are the stakeholders on the outside that are influential, which ones have no voice. And so it's important to really know the politics of an issue from a member standpoint, elected official standpoint, and stakeholder standpoint. And so that's really important to be savvy politically. And then there's people. You've heard it said that in this town, it's a function of who you know. And that's true, but only to a certain degree. And yes, in lobbying, in government affairs, it's important to have connections and relationships, but it goes well beyond that. It's a matter of knowing how to establish a rapport with people, developing relationships, having interpersonal skills, and really having credibility with people. And that's a function of being genuine and developing those relationships, networking not for the sake of networking and to further your own agenda, but to help others. And I just want to end on this note, and I think you've heard all of this before, but mentoring, being a mentor to others and receiving mentorship is so very important. Norm Mineta, who's one of my role models, former Secretary of Commerce, former Secretary of Transportation, always talks about the importance of mentorship and how it's important for all of us, just as all of us have learned from the skills and experience of others, that we too have a responsibility to pull those up behind, who are coming up behind us, and share with them what we've learned along the way. So just as all of you are here to learn from others, we also have a responsibility and obligation to help those who are coming up behind us. So with that, I just want to thank you for the time. and I look forward to meeting some of you later tonight. Thanks.